Sheguli. I'm this year's co-host, all of the co-hosts, and then I have honorable chance to start this kind of opening remark for day two. I really hope you enjoyed the first day presentation and all the panels. Let me tell you one thing. Once upon a time, there is a place called Cafe Algiers on Gretel Street on Cambridge, across the river. That's the place Yena and I occasionally met, drinking mint tea together, and then chatting about the life and the universe. And then eventually we came to learn about, both of us are interested in worker participation. So since then, this idea stuck with us, about like 15 years. And then we finally found perfect timing. So this is why we are here. So personally, I felt so impressed yesterday at this conference. I hope you feel the same thing, Jeff. So yesterday, we explored the historical background and the current status of work ownership and employee ownership. We have three amazing panels. So we started with what is work ownership theoretical foundation. Yena Xie, Chris Markin here, Adria Sharp, and Ivan Edward all shared amazing story. I shared just a key highlight of the panel, each panel. One of the things I learned, impressed by the panelist comment is Evan Edwards says, our identity shaped by ownership. So all of us know we are what we eat, right? So he just gave us another lesson. We are what we have, what we own. So this is a great lesson for me. And then fireside chat. So we had three amazing panelists, Courtney Funk, Bobby Lane, and Anne Linghouse, moderated by Ethan Ren here. Bobby Lane says, employee ownership culture based on trust between managers and employees, eventually creating collective identity. So collective identity, that's kind of one of the words really touched me. And then finally, we got keynote by Joseph Lassie here. And then Corey Rosen also shared the historical background. And then Maureen Conway says, ownership means connection. And I really didn't know before that employee ownership is related to catfish. It's all about the tax credit. And then one of I think the most important lessons that I got yesterday is former Harvard President Elliott tried to merge MIT. Harvard is kind of amazing story. And then, so that's kind of what we did, what we learned yesterday. I believe you did you did the same thing. Your thought and your thought becomes different before and after this conference. And today, we'll have the chance to consider future thought about the employee ownership or worker ownership through four engaging panels: economic benefit, management and democracy, financing, and government leadership. Okay. So that's the one thing I have to tell you, housekeeping things. I have to read this one. We are recording all of the session during the conference. So while the focus on filming will be on the speakers, there's a chance you may be on the camera during the Q&A. If you wish, make sure you are off camera. Please make sure you are sitting on the back two rows. Okay. And then during the conference, we will be filming short interviews with the conference attendees. So they will be used to our media channels set out as part of our strategy to help raise more. Okay, so if you see some folks in and out, then they are not rude. They are in the schedule. That's the point. Last thing, the bathroom. I think everyone knows about bathroom. Where is the bathroom, right? Okay, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Those of you who are from the Boston area know that sometimes there's traffic and you can never predict it. So if we appreciate all of you being here, but also we appreciate you having grace with us for the late start, as we were just making sure folks that were caught coming from the west were able to arrive on time. So thank you for your patience. I'm excited to welcome our first moderator, Kevin Kurtulus. Kevin Kurtulus is the Central Massachusetts Regional Director for the Massachusetts Office of Business Development and is the interim director of the newly created Massachusetts Center for Employee Ownership, a new agency that is focused on growing employee ownership in the state. Prior to his work with MOBD, he spent 8 years as an elected state representative here in Massachusetts. Kevin Kurtulus, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Active part. Okay, good. Pleasure to be here with you all. I see some current friends in the audience and hopefully some new friends to be during the course of the day. Would love to chat with as many of you as possible, learn more about you, and have you learn more about us and what we're doing at the center. So we've had just a small change in the schedule here for this particular session. As Tony mentioned, the Mass Pike being the Mass Pike, our planned first speaker is running a little bit late. So we're going to jump to speaker 2. I'd just like to introduce Olga Prushinskaya. I apologize if I mispronounced that. Olga is the Director of Metrics and Impact at the Democracy at Work Institute, and she leads efforts to measure and communicate the impact of the growing worker ownership field, cultivates research partnerships to expand its knowledge base, and works to advance the sharing of data and related tools to reduce silos and strengthen the ecosystem. Now, as someone with a degree in quantitative business analysis, this intrigues me because I love hearing about metrics. So with no further ado, Olga, thank you.
I'll go. Guys, stand here, over there. Does it matter? Okay. Great. How's this volume, everybody? Is this okay? Good, great. Good morning, everybody. Like Kevin mentioned, I'm here from the Democracy at Work Institute. If you all aren't familiar with our work, we're a think and do tank that's focused on growing worker cooperatives specifically. So I'll be presenting a lot of data today. It's important to note that it's going to be all focused on worker co-ops and democratic workplaces as a whole. So in telling the story of the economic impact of worker ownership, I wanted to talk a little bit about the different data sources that we use to kind of draw a few different conclusions. So over the last 10 years of our existence, DAWI has been collecting data on both businesses and individuals. On the business level research that we do, you can see here, if you know of our State of the Sector reports, that's our effort every 2 years to get together with our partner, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. We get together, we say, what are all the worker co-ops that we know about? We create this giant list. We email all of them to see if they'll fill out a survey for us. We ask them questions about business origin, how they did over the last year, financial performance, their workforce, the impact of external factors such as more recently, natural disasters, the pandemic. So a little bit of everything. We get a lot of data from there. And as you can see, we've published a lot of State of the Sector reports on our findings. And then on the other side, we have our research on individual workers. So the last time this effort took place was in 2017, and that was under the leadership of Laura Hansen-Schlachter, who's incredible. We actually just got funding to repeat this research, which was really exciting, and that's going to be with the leadership of Michael Palmieri from Kent State and Trevor Young-Heyman from the University of Pittsburgh. This research really focuses on the experiences of workers. We ask them about how their experiences at their cooperative compared to their previous job, how they experience wealth building, how they experience autonomy, how satisfied are they, how much training they receive, how they participate in governance, a little bit of everything. So between these two data collection efforts, we have a lot of data from the last 10 years, and we've been able to draw a few very large conclusions. I only have 10 minutes with you all, so I'm gonna just do a really high level swath of the conclusions we've come to, but I'll link all the reports at the end. I hope you do check them out just because they have a lot more nuance and detail, which you might be interested to read. So the first big conclusion that we've been able to draw is that worker cooperatives are a growing sector in the US. So you can see on this slide our data from the last time we collected it in 2023. We identified about 750 firms that had about 11,000 workers and had a combined revenue of about $500 million. It is important to note that we know this is an undercount. We're two national level organizations trying to make this list of co-ops. There's a lot of blind spots that we have, especially with recent startups or businesses that aren't working with one of our partners. So we estimate the true number of firms to be closer to 1,200 and the true number of workers to be closer to 15,000. And over the last 10 years, we've actually seen the number of firms almost double. So there's definite growth in the field, and a lot of that growth is driven by specific industries. So you can see here on the left, the top industries from when we collected this data last. It includes things like food-related businesses, consulting services, agriculture, cleaning, engineering, manufacturing, construction. Probably not super surprising to folks in the room. But I did want to point out that there's also been a lot of growth in a lot of industries over the last 10 years, even though they haven't cracked it into this list of top 5 or 6 industries. And that includes businesses in the childcare sector, in home care, and in things like solar installation. So the next big conclusion that we've been able to draw from our data is that we see that worker cooperatives are providing tangible material benefits to their workers. So in general, we've seen that workers are earning higher wages and receiving better benefits at their cooperative than they did previously at their non-cooperative jobs. So you can see here on the left that the bulk of the workers feel that their pay is much higher as compared to their previous workforce. And when we ask folks to share information about their wages, we see that the cooperative wage boost is almost $4 per hour, which is huge. And in general, we hear from workers that their pay at their cooperative meets their family's needs better and allows them to save more money than they were able to at their previous jobs. We also see that worker cooperatives are allowing workers to build wealth. So most folks who were eligible to receive a patronage distribution when we asked at the time of the research did receive one. And at the median, they received about $2,000 per distribution. We also asked about the value of their accumulated equity, and we saw that was also about $2,000 per person. And it's obviously important to note that this figure varies wildly by industry. So tech co-ops are going to look really different than a cleaning co-op. So at this point, I'm talking about all these benefits to the workers. You might be wondering, who are these workers? Consistently over the last 10 years, we've seen that the majority of workers at worker cooperatives are BIPOC women. And this really continues to tell the story that we hear all the time, which is that folks are using this business forum as an opportunity to access business ownership in ways they wouldn't be able to otherwise in conventional businesses. The next big conclusion is that, there's a lot of benefits to workers, but there's also a lot of benefits to the firms with this business forum. We see overall that worker cooperatives have better working conditions than conventional business forms. So you can see here on the right that consistently workers are rating their cooperative job much better in terms of job security, in terms of their confidence in the company's economic stability, in terms of the work effort that they put in terms of their own job satisfaction, much higher. And we consistently hear from workers about other benefits, such as they have much better relationship to their management. There's much better things like conflict resolution at their business. So in general, those are really translating to pretty huge gains for worker co-ops in terms of both job satisfaction, worker productivity, and worker retention. So you can see here on the left, half of workers say they're not likely to quit in the next year. And at a time when the average tenure of a worker at a conventional business is just under 4 years, we see that at worker cooperatives, workers tend to stay for about 6 years. The next big conclusion is that we see that worker cooperatives are a resilient and responsive business model. From collecting our data over the last 5 years, we've really seen our data line up with other research that's showing that worker cooperatives are a more resilient business form, especially in times of economic downturn. There's a lot of ways that we saw this exhibited in the wake of the pandemic when we were collecting this data. The first being that worker cooperatives had much higher rates of worker retention as compared to conventional businesses. When we asked people for details about what that looked like, we heard stories of the workers came together and we decided to all take a 10% pay cut in order to avoid laying off 1 or 2 of our coworkers. So it's just examples of how responsive people can be and flexible in responding to a crisis. Other stories that we heard are that worker cooperatives are prioritizing the health, well-being, safety of their workforce. They're expanding healthcare offerings. They're expanding sick leave and accommodations for childcare. We saw that they were very responsive to community needs as well as the needs of other co-ops. So we heard a ton of examples about co-ops working with mutual aid networks or creating a pantry for people to get goods that were hard to access, like diapers. And we heard stories of cooperatives prioritizing working with other cooperatives for their supply chain, to share resources, to have referrals. And then we also saw that about half of cooperatives changed their business model during the pandemic. So I think that again speaks to how responsive the business forum can be. The changes that people noted were, we moved from brick and mortar to virtual offerings. We expanded the types of offerings that we have. And lastly, we saw that there was a high rate of worker co-op formation that obviously reflects what was going on with startups at the time during the pandemic in general. When we asked these businesses, why did you start your business during the pandemic? A lot of the reasons we heard were, we were laid off and we needed a quality job, or there was a service missing from my community and we needed to start a business in order to fill it. I really love Joseph's use or creation of the term party facts yesterday, and I feel like I just gave you all a bunch of like worker ownership party facts that are fun and splashy. But there's obviously a lot of nuance, there's a lot more detail, there's a lot of needs that these businesses have that I didn't get into here. So I do hope you check out the reports that I referenced. They're all linked here. I think it's also important to note just how much remains unknown. We have huge data gaps to be able to tell fully the story of worker cooperatives. And I do want to note that the data I referenced here in this presentation is all available for folks to access to use for their own research. So both the data on businesses and the data of individual workers. I know there's some folks in the room who have already made use of it, so I hope you all will consider accessing that as well. And with that, I will say thank you. Thank you for listening to me speed talk, and I really just look forward to the panel discussion as well.
Olga, thank you. So one of the charges that the Center for Employee Ownership's Advisory Board gave us as we're just standing up the center is to produce an accurate inventory of employee and worker-owned businesses across the Commonwealth. So I would like to connect with you offline at some point. I think we already have your data, but I'd just like to double check that we're working with the most current data.
That
if we
sounds
could.
great.
So, great. So we're Fidan?
Yes.
Okay.
Am I on?
No, and just a second. So we're back on track now with our speakers. Thank you for fighting the Mass Pike traffic. I can relate. I came from the Worcester area, so certainly feel your pain. Fidan Kurtulus is a professor of economics at UMass Amherst, where she is also a founding director of the University of Massachusetts Center for Employment Equity. She has published research on a variety of labor economics topics, including the benefits of broad-based employee share ownership and democratic workplace practices, and recently spoke at the U.S. Senate on the benefits of employee ownership. Fidan?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's a beautiful Cambridge day today. I guess technically we're in Alston, but, same thing. I have been conducting research on broad-based employee ownership for the last 15 years. And I was tasked today with speaking about the research evidence on how employee ownership can strengthen our economy. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. I have structured my comments into sort of 4 elements. First, I'm going to talk very briefly about the prevalence of employee ownership in the U.S. I think yesterday there was a lot of discussion on this, so I'm going to keep that brief. Then I'm going to talk about my research on how employee ownership can improve employment stability and reduce unemployment in the macroeconomy as a whole. I will also talk about the relationship between employee ownership and worker productivity, and finally conclude with my newest project using U.S. Census data looking at employee ownership in manufacturing and labor productivity. So, as was mentioned, this is largely based off my remarks at the U.S. Senate recently. According to the 2022 wave of the General Social Survey, which is a nationally representative survey of the U.S. Conducted by the University of Chicago National Opinion Research Center, 24.5 million employees at for-profit companies own some stock in the company where they work. And this amounts to about 20% of workers at such companies holding company stock. 25.7% of all employees in durable manufacturing and 27.5% of all employees in non-durable manufacturing report owning stock in the company where they work. So this is an important phenomenon. This is why we're all here, because a meaningful portion of the U.S. economy is involved in broad-based employee ownership. So I want to talk to you a little about employment stability. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book with Doug Cruz showing that firms with broad-based employee equity ownership provided greater employment stability to their workers during the recessions of 2001 and 2008, the Great Recession. So put differently, when faced with a negative economic shock, employee ownership firms were less likely to fire their workers than firms without employee ownership. We looked at publicly traded firms. We looked at the universe of publicly traded firms in the United States during the decade spanning 1999 to 2011, a period which included 2 recessions. We used Form 5500 pension records from the Department of Labor. And one of our key findings was that firms without employee ownership in their defined contribution pension plans decreased employment by 3%, whereas firms with any employee ownership in their defined contribution plans decreased employment by only 2.8%, and firms with any ESOPs decreased employment by only 1.7%, when the economy did worse as measured by an economy-wide unemployment rate increase of 1%. Another key finding that we revealed was that employee ownership firms were more likely to survive through recessions. Specifically, we found that firms with employee ownership were only 78% as likely as those with no employee ownership to disappear over the decade that we examined. The share of workers involved in employee ownership in the company also had an effect on the likelihood of survival. We looked at pay flexibility, how pay flexibility and productivity contributes to these results. And we showed that it was primarily the productivity channel that contributed to these positive benefits of employee ownership on employment stability and firm survival. So our findings that employee ownership is linked to greater employment stability and greater likelihood of firm survival through recessionary pressures points to strong positive externalities of employee ownership on the overall economy. Reducing unemployment, it can lead to reduced unemployment and thereby the harmful effects on communities like higher crime rates and lower tax base for supporting infrastructure and public goods. By lowering government expenditures on unemployment compensation and other forms of support for dislocated workers and economically stressed families, and boosting consumer purchasing power and aggregate demand for greater macroeconomic stability under recessionary pressures. We therefore support introducing tax policies that create greater incentives for firms to adopt broad-based employee ownership. Chris talked about bills that are circulating in Congress at the moment that support firm adoption of employee ownership. And we also support introducing programs that can spread information about the benefits of employee ownership and how employee ownership programs can be set up at firms. So I don't have very much time left, and I want to mention briefly my most recent project using U.S. Census data to look at broad-based employee ownership in the U.S. manufacturing. So in this project, we are looking at when workers have ownership stakes in the companies where they work, does labor productivity rise? And do management and organizational practices affect the relationship between employee equity ownership, productivity, and employment growth? For this project, we are linking some very large data sets, and it's the largest data compilation effort to date on employee ownership. We link workplace-level microdata from the U.S. Census's Management and Organizational Practices Survey, the U.S. Longitudinal Business Database, the American Survey of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Department of Labor's Form 5500 pension records. This is the first introduction of the U.S. Census's Management and Organizational Practices Survey into the employee ownership research landscape. It's a really nice survey that was spearheaded in 2010 by Nick Bloom at Stanford University. Some of you may be familiar with this. We're very excited about this new project. We are working out of the Census Research Data Center across the river at the NBER. And we have, in our analysis, we have 32,000 establishments within 18,000 firms for the years 2000 and 2015. And we're able to conduct a longitudinal analysis, which is very helpful because we can nail, we can get at causality in our relationships. And what we're showing actually is when firms switch from non-ESOP to ESOP status, there's about a 10% increase in their labor productivity over 5 years. This is quite substantial. We also find that firms that switch from non-ESOP to ESOP status exhibit substantial employment growth compared to firms that do not adopt an ESOP. I'm not permitted to say any magnitudes at this moment because those numbers haven't cleared the U.S. Census's disclosure processes. But please keep your eyes peeled for our results on our website for our newly disclosed results on employment growth effects as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fidan. It's always nice when data and statistics kind of align themselves with anecdotal experiences. Just let me share something with you very quickly. When, as mentioned in my introduction, I had the great honor of being in the legislature for 8 years. And that 8 years spanned the last economic downturn. And so one of the most common phone calls I would get from constituent businesses was, how do we access unemployment benefits? What support is available from the Commonwealth for that? And then out of the blue, I get a phone call from a business that said, hey, we're wondering if there's training grants available because we want to retool our workforce. We want to go from traditional machinists to CNC trained operators. And also we're hiring about a dozen people. Okay? As it turns out, that was an ESOP that was in my district. So it's really nice to hear the statistics back up my own personal anecdotal experience there. So. Our next speaker is Thad Williamson, professor of philosophy, politics, economics, and law at the University of Richmond, where he's taught since 2005 after earning his doctorate in political science here at Harvard. He has also worked extensively in city government in Richmond, previously serving as the inaugural director of the city's Office of Community Wealth Building, and currently as senior policy strategist in the mayor's office. Pat?
Well, good morning. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm sort of overdetermined in terms of my participation in this conference. Some 4 different points of connection to fill in. One is, in my early career, I worked with the political economist Karl Alperovitz for about a decade, who was involved in some of the early discussions about worker ownership in the 70s and 80s, and we did a book together called Making a Place for Community, Local Democracy in a Global Era from 2002. Which had a whole chapter on employee ownership. And the thesis of that book was basically, without a serious strategy to stabilize the economic basis of communities being threatened by suburban sprawl, by internal capital mobility, and by globalization, the local democracy would atrophy and the democracy as a whole would eventually be imperiled. And I mention that because I continue to think that we kind of had a point then. The second is actually my work with, alongside a few others, Martin O'Neill, the late Wahid Hussein. We sort of got together to determine we're going to try to elevate John Rawls' idea of property and democracy as a serious thing. It had sort of been somewhat neglected for a few years, and we ended up doing a volume together called Property and Democracy, Rawls and Beyond from 2012, which ties together some of the philosophical pieces. Yeah, and Nina's work has been incredible in articulating the philosophical dimensions of that. The third piece is my the fact that I've been the live-in roommate of Dr. Igor Sharf for the last 27 years. And I say that is relevant because there's nothing I could possibly tell you about employee ownership that she can tell you better with more accuracy and detail. So I'm going to lead into the fourth role, which is my sort of role as a practitioner and theorist of community wealth building based in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, so some context on Richmond. I could give you tons of data. We just published a book on Richmond from 1980 to 2016. So this is very, very basic, extreme levels of racial inequality and also inequality between the city center and the surrounding suburban area. City of Richmond itself is about 230,000 people within a metropolitan area of about 1.25 million people. And I would say that these particular statistics are tame on almost any measure of inequality or measure of economic opportunity. Richmond typically ranks among the worst 1% to 2% of county units in the country in terms of promoting economic mobility, in terms of inequality of income. So in Virginia, cities are actually considered county units where they're independent. So, you can't possibly read that. I'll have to read it for you. Sorry, my bad. So a fundamental question is, and we all, wherever you live, you probably are seeing similar data. So the major question is are we okay with this? Are we okay with accumulated racial wealth inequality continuing for another generation? And so Richmond it's a long story, but our former mayor, Dwight C. Jones, who had spent his entire adult life in Richmond, a Black Baptist pastor, was determined before he left office to try to do something serious, not just to reduce poverty, although that was the terminology initially, but to think systemically and think about how do we overturn the system of accumulated racial and economic injustice. And so I worked with him to establish Dallas Community Wealth Building. As many people were involved, and sort of the secret sauce in it is we had community members who were most impacted at the table, which gave the whole thing a lot more credibility. So that office got established in 2014, and I'm very happy last night because the city council just approved it for its 12th year of operation. So it's a thing that's now lasted into its third mayor. And over that time period, and we do not take all the credit for this, it's a complicated story, but poverty has in fact declined substantially over the last 10 years from about 26% to 18 to 19%. So there's a lot going on there I'd be happy to talk about. But we certainly, if you asked me 10 years ago, I'd be happy to be telling that story, that level of progress has been made. Nonetheless, the fundamental systems reproducing racial inequality remain in place. And gigantic concentration of public housing, highly segregated schools, you go on and on and on. So the fundamentals are still there. So today I want to speak to both the potential and imperative for advocates of employee ownership to link to broader community level strategies for expanding economic opportunity. So the sort of book plug, after I'd stepped out of my time with the city, I worked with Melody Barnes, who is at the University of Virginia, the Aspen Institute, and had been part of Barack Obama's first administration to try to sort of theorize this idea of community wealth building. The gist of it is that we know American democracy has been a deeply flawed project from the very beginning. So, a paradigm that's going to be successful has to address some realities that neither the right or left have wanted to talk about. So, and community wealth building, as I have coined it, and this is not the academic description. This is like what I wrote in the newsletter to explain to everyone else in the city of Richmond what the heck we were doing, right? And so it's a community that includes everyone, okay? Wealth means it must address material realities, like who actually has stuff. And building means it's an ongoing process over time. So what we're talking about is literally reconstructing American democracy in a bold evolutionary way to change the distribution of wealth and power in the U.S. in a more equitable direction. And the four sort of thoughts, like one, democracy in America is fragile, leave it at that. Second, that democracy must include everyone, and this has obviously been feebly compromised by the long legacy of white supremacy, so we need a deliberate effort to build a more inclusive society over time. Third, inclusion means inviting people to the table. So governments at all levels should be creating avenues for citizens to actually help construct policies. And related to that is that more easily happens at the local level. I mean, very, very few people are ever in position to meaningfully influence federal policy, but lots of people can show up at their town meeting, city council meeting, and have a say. And often there are commissions or boards or lots of things people can get involved with. Okay, so the principles of practice that Melanie and I worked out is basically it starts with participation, which is often the part that's skipped over. Not the academic, hey, we have the answer, but let's actually talk to people and be willing to meaningfully learn and reshape what you're doing based on input. Second, to set a bold goal. And so like in the case of Richmond, Mayor Jones set the goal that we're going to cut poverty by 40% in 15 years. And we're going to cut child poverty by half in 15 years. And we're over halfway to both those goals. And that's important because, and then the next Mayor Stoney, who left office, repeated that goal, is that mindset was informing lots of policies besides just with the Office of Community Wealth Building, which means the agency. Third, thinking about wealth holistically, involving venture capital, physical capital, human capital, social capital. And then lastly, you actually have to change who gets paid. Yeah, and this is where employee ownership potentially comes in. So, wealth building policies, you're familiar with all this, but it's just to show that employee ownership is obviously one of them, but there's many other things that plausibly contribute to community wealth building, and the city of Richmond is involved one way or another in most of these. But to the employee ownership piece, so to cut to the chase, we when I was director, we commissioned a study to look at how to replicate the Evergreen Cooperative model from Cleveland and Richmond, and the Democracy Collaborative came and did a fine study and had recommendations, and we basically weren't able to implement. And so I was like, well, that's kind of embarrassing. On our hands, like, this is how we learn, right? And let's just tell you the truth. And so we found, like, there's a lack of supportive legal framework in Virginia. Like the very first thing that we wanted to do, which was to set up a parallel nonprofit to work alongside a city agency, our city attorney said, no, you can't do that under Virginia state law. So that's point one. Then it was also very challenging to build the kind of political relationships they had in Cleveland. And here we suffer from the fact that Mayor Jones left office, because I think he would be able to do it. New mayor comes in, a slightly different set of priorities. Thirdly, the model of trying to build your business from the ground inherently deeply challenging, as most of you know. Then it's also a question of how can we justify putting public resources into this as opposed to something else, given the risk and cost involved and the political necessity, especially for new entity, to get quicker wins. So that's why we leaned into basically workforce development as a lower cost strategy to move the needle quicker and build credibility over time. So, and all that, that's what really happened. It wasn't ideological objections or anything else. So the idea is still on the table, and so I'm going to just leave you with the plea for help for is, how do America's cities, America's mayors find ways to, at relatively low cost and relatively low risk, support employee ownership? And I think, as others have mentioned, focusing on transitions makes a lot of sense. I'm encouraged here with what they're doing in St. Paul and a few other places. But I think there's a desperate need for a playbook that mayors, without being deeply involved or having ties to places like this, can figure out how do we do this at a cost that's acceptable, given that mayors have to deal with water systems and housing and infrastructure, education, tons of other needs that they have to deal with if they haven't got reelected. So I'll leave it that with a plea for help. And I'll say one last thing. Thank you for putting this on. And I was thinking to myself, man, I feel like I've always been interested in employee ownership. But it's actually not true. I had to learn from somebody, and it was my sophomore and junior year at Brown University, two heterodox economists, Howard Weil and Gil Skillman, who told me about Mondragon and things like that. So what happens or doesn't happen in economics and business schools curriculum is incredibly important. So thank you, Harvard, for pushing the needle.
We're going to move right into the panel. So if I could ask our three speakers to join us up the panelist seats. So just to give you a sense for how we're going to time box this, we're going to do some prompted questions first for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for about 20 minutes of questions from the audience, if that makes sense. Okay. I would just ask our panelists to err on the side of brevity so that we get to hear everybody's opinion on a variety of questions here. So first question, if you could tell every business leader, government official, and potential worker/owner one thing about the economic benefits of worker ownership, what would you share with them? Who's going to bat lead off?
I can get started. Well, I think to me, the biggest story of worker ownership is kind of the story of job quality. I think there's just been a growth in low-quality jobs in the U.S. for a long time, and in stark contrast to that, worker-owned firms are offering alternatives of high-quality jobs, and they're doing that in industries that are essential and that also have historically been marked by worker exploitation. So right now we're in a childcare crisis where a lot of us can't access quality and affordable childcare. There's not enough home care workers for all of us as we're getting older and sicker. A lot of us live in a food desert where we can't access quality food. So all of those industries are industries where worker-owned firms are seeing not only success in their business, but they're also seeing a lot of satisfaction from their workers, high-quality jobs. The workers are building wealth and getting paid more and all these things. So I think if we're able to grow that to scale, not only would it impact a lot of workers and change their lives in a lot of ways in their experiences at work, but it would benefit all of us because those are all things that we need on an increasing basis.
I'll go next. So I already said a bunch of things about the positive effects of employee ownership on worker productivity, firm survival, employment stability. But what it really comes down to is that when a worker has an ownership stake in the company where they work, they feel that they're accountable for the fruits of their labor, and they get to share in the fruits of that labor, and it gives workers the dignity and the satisfaction of seeing, okay, so I'm more productive, and I can actually see the benefit of that productivity and how well my overall company is doing, and I get to share in that wealth. And so it ultimately gives workers dignity, and there's a lot of research from, for example, the General Social Survey, showing, as you said, employee owners have greater job satisfaction. So it leads to greater happiness among workers, and I think happy workers lead to a happy society. So ultimately, that's the greatest benefit.
Dad, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, Evan was pushing me last night at dinner, like, what problem do you think worker ownership can actually solve in Richmond? And it's not so much wages and security, all those things are obviously incredibly important. It's the racial wealth gap. And how do you tell a story to African-American kid growing up in a 60% poverty neighborhood that you can have a future that's not just, success is not just working for the man, so to speak, but we can actually own something. And it's realistic, and it's not like high-risk entrepreneurial, lemonade cart model, where somebody will make it, but most people try that won't, right? But it's something that offers both security and ownership.
So something that we've done at the Mass Center for Employee Ownership is we've done regional symposiums, and we invite ESOPs and co-ops to speak. And what we're hearing more and more about is one of the intangible benefits or tangible benefits of worker and employee ownership is better succession planning, because it gives the worker owners kind of a path forward to grow professionally. And so I just wondering if any of you have any comments on that. Yeah? No?
Yeah, I can start. I think it's absolutely something we see in worker co-ops as well. When we're talking about businesses that convert to a worker co-op form, that's often a huge reason that owners bring to the table of, I want to explore some form of worker ownership because I want the business to stay in my community. I want the workers who've been there for decades to be able to benefit from all of their labor in building the business and to continue to have job security, keep everything in the community itself. So that's definitely something that we see as true for worker co-ops and a major reason why owners are growingly interested in worker ownership, I think.
So one comment I had is in terms of succession. So when, let's say a person built up a company from scratch and into a very successful large company, and they had a vision and the workers embody that vision and they want to retire. They can sell it and, to a stranger, and they have no there's no saying what's going to happen to that company in the future. It might get completely shut down. It might get chopped up for parts and sold different parts to different entities. But one way that employee ownership ESOPs kind of alleviate the vision that the original owner and the original workers had for this company is that if it's sold to the workers, they continue that vision. So the legacy of the firm continues, and the vision of the original, owner, the person who founded it, continues. The vision of the workers continues. And so that's a very nice thing, and that's something that employee ownership allows.
Pat, do you want to add?
I'm good.
Okay, great. So each form of worker ownership offers workers different economic rights. How do you think about the trade-offs and benefits of the various models? Any thoughts?
I can go.
Olga, bat lead off every time.
I have a lot to say. I think that for me, I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a trade-off, though it's really clear that the forms offer really different things. So from my data, you saw that worker cooperatives offer much less wealth accumulation opportunities over time, for example, from ESOPs or other forms of worker ownership. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of benefits that come from different aspects. So I think from what we've seen in our data, the democratic management piece is pretty huge. And it feels a little bit silly that I just gave you all this presentation on the economic benefits of worker co-ops, because when we actually ask workers, what is the reason you're here at this company? What drew you here? What keeps you here? Overwhelmingly, people are like, yeah, the economic benefits are great, but what keeps me here is autonomy, voice in the company. I can weigh in on the direction of the business. So I feel like that's a huge benefit for worker cooperative, and not only worker cooperative, to the point that was being made yesterday of these forms don't necessarily have to be in their purest form for all of them to benefit. So if we can infuse the democratic management piece into other forms of worker ownership as well, there's a lot of benefits that can come with that. Yeah.
Anybody else?
So I think the notion of democracy is really central to employee ownership. We live in a fairly democratic society. The United States was founded on the ideals of democracy, and one of the key aspects of broad-based employee ownership is it's a democratic workplace. Workers, have a share in the pie. Employee ownership firms have greater voice. There's more decision-making autonomy that workers have. And, to the extent that we care about democratic institutions, employee ownership is one that we should care a lot about. And I think that's why there's, support across the political spectrum on this topic, because it's democratic.
I mean, I think they're all beneficial potentially, and the cooperative can be the most pure democratic quorum, but there's challenges when you get to scale, right? And so if it calls itself a cooperative, it probably isn't really, right? I think that's fine. Joseph said yesterday we have to be pragmatic to a point. There has to be a line somewhere about what counts as democratic and what doesn't.
Yeah, something that we've heard is that, with ESOPs primarily being portrayed as this is part of your retirement planning, that, to the younger workers, that may or may not have as much relevance as being a true worker owner in the co-op model, where you're benefiting on an annual basis from distributions within the company. So we have heard that difference as well over the years. So next question: to what extent is economic benefit a necessary component of worker ownership? You just mentioned some of the democratic aspects of it. Any other thoughts?
Yeah. So, even if the workers were not increasing their wealth, which they are, employee ownership results in hundreds of thousands of dollars in increase in the retirement portfolios of these employee owners. But even if that didn't exist, there's the element of, democracy. Workers, individuals like voicing their opinions, and they like to be involved in the decision-making processes. So, one of the positive aspects is it's a democratic workplace. What else?
I think that the community benefit that Gar and I were talking about 25 years ago is incredibly important in terms of if you're a worker owned, presumably you're less likely to relocate altogether. And at least the workers will have to say if someone's coming in, with an offer. They can take the money or not, but at least they have that choice. Whereas they don't in the conventional setup. So as a way to help stabilize capital in place and allow communities to be more secure, so politicians can think about quality of life and not just how about to chase the next job or the next corporation to come to town. All that is a contribution to community economic quality of life.
And following up on that, there's research showing that workers in employee ownership companies have a greater propensity to vote, be more engaged in community activities, community service, and are simply more involved in, civic activities. So, one might say, well, is it a self-selection? Are workers who are more likely to voice, or they more want to be involved in civic things and voting and so on? Are they drawn to work at employee ownership companies, or does it go the other way around? That's very hard to nail down, but there is, I think, a relationship between being community-minded and caring about the society that you live in and employee ownership, and that's a benefit.
And something we've seen is, oftentimes the employee-owned businesses will do a thing like afternoon off for a community cleanup day, those types of things, and it's not an anomaly. I see it more often than I don't see it in worker and employee-owned businesses, so that is encouraging as far as the community involvement is concerned.
Yeah, and I think I'll add just one more thing, which is economic benefit is huge, but I think one thing we see for worker co-ops, at least specifically, is that a huge portion of those 750 firms are businesses that were formed to not necessarily grow over time and not even necessarily be very profitable, but they're there to meet a very specific and necessary need. So I think in terms of thinking about economic benefit, to me, it's a bigger picture thing for the community, kind of like everyone's saying as well.
Got anything else then?
Oh, good.
So most of the discussion of economic ownership by workers focuses on when companies are profitable and can distribute dividends. Are there drawbacks to worker ownership in economic downturns or times when companies are not as profitable? Thought or insight?
Well, we heard yesterday during the pandemic, Flatiron's companies were much slower to lay people off. So I would actually posit that in most cases they'll be more resilient to a downturn, to a conventional verb.
Yeah, I would agree. I think from my data, we saw that the form itself was almost protective. So although worker-owned firms suffered in the same ways a lot of small businesses did, the form itself allowed the workers to be nimble and to ride out the crisis and get to the other side. So in that way, I don't think it was a detriment, even though it is obviously hard for a business to ride out those hard times.
So one of the findings is that employee-owned firms think about the long game. So, when there's a recession, they're retaining workers instead of laying them off. And so the short-term profits are lower. because they're basically doing something that's not profit maximizing. However, the long-term productivity is higher. So employee ownership has a more long-term perspective as opposed to a short-term perspective. And I think yesterday, I think it was Gerardo who had the comment that, companies care so much about quarterly profits, and they kind of lose sight of the long-term, well-being of the company and long-term profits and so on. And I think one might think that at the, what I'm trying to say here is that short-term profits may suffer, but long-term profits are higher. Long-term productivity is higher. And, that's one negative, but a greater positive.
Personally, in a prior life, I worked in IT and management consulting. And the company I worked for had a profit-sharing pension fund that they would distribute entirely, on their dime, did not require match. But there was a 5-year cliff vesting schedule. So you had to be there 5 years in order to participate in this, right? Well, if you know anything about IT and management consulting, it's a very transient industry. Our turnover was so much lower than our like-sized competitors because of this incentive that was there. And so to echo your comment about, you may lower the profit on any given year, but maintaining talent is as important as profitability, one would argue.
Right, it's a human capital issue as well. When you find good talent, you train them, it is a huge loss in human capital if there's a lot of churn. You're releasing those workers that you've trained and found in the short term. Whereas if you can retain those workers, you retain that costly investment that you made in these workers, finding them and training them, and that actually ultimately leads to long-term higher productivity.
Happy you say?
No.
Oh.
So,
You okay, you're ready to-
I'd love to hear this, but the audience has questions too.
Yeah, I do have just one last question too, if we could. So you all have done significant research in your respective areas of expertise. And I guess, what are the most important research questions to increase knowledge of the economic benefits of worker-owned firms? And then where do you see opportunities for practitioners and academicians to collaborate?
I have a couple of words on this. I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but actually this stems from a couple of the discussions that I had yesterday. One of them was, I'm not sure if she's here, but there was a woman from KKR, and she's not here today. And I asked her, I said, from your perspective, what are the remaining empirical questions that need to be nailed? Because we're at the verge of this huge, data effort with the census data and the annual survey of manufacturers and so on. And she said, we need to nail down causality. And this sounds, like empirical researchers, they're obsessed with this topic, and it's kind of frustrating because it's hard to nail it down. But, is it that employee ownership is leading to improved productivity, or, is it just a correlation or what? So I think that one of the things that we really need to address is, does employee ownership result in improved benefits? And that's something that panel data, longitudinal data, can address. Another issue that I spoke with Ethan about yesterday, so I'm kind of a big data person, but it's really important. Like, I cannot pinpoint the mechanisms very well. I don't know the stories. So case studies are really important. Being able to do randomized controlled trials, for example, get in touch with the company before they implement employee ownership, and then look at after they implement employee ownership, and do surveys of the workers before and after, and just try and get an understanding of the stories and the mechanisms. It's really what's going on. That's something I can't really do. So it's really important to collaborate with folks who can do that.
I can't speak for other city halls, but I do think at Richmond City Hall, the standards around causality and whatnot are a little bit less rigorous than most academia. And so people, they want to know it's not going to work and what the risk is. and they're not overly concerned about the 99% or 95% degree of confidence, to summarize. But I will say that it's something, making a place community, we wrote this one too, that like every state should have a center like the center you're leading in Massachusetts, or the Ohio Employee Ownership Center that John Logue has set up, and to put them in state capitals where it can be at the heart of policy, it can sort of mainstream the concept into the economic development practice of both the state government and localities. And I would love to also relocate UMass Amherst down in its economics department, down to Richmond and everywhere else. But seriously, we do need like the kinds of networks of informed the next strategic practitioners in academics. That's something that should be strategically done in every state capital. And if anyone wants to pony up that to happen in Richmond on behalf of our mayor, to say y'all come, you would love it. And that thing would really make a difference.
I'd like to ask just a follow-up question because I think it's directly related. Given our position with the center, so I have a foot in employee ownership, but also a foot in government, right? There's another center here, and also the National Center for Employee Ownership. What policy changes at the federal and/or state levels could further accelerate the growth of employee-owned businesses? One of our missions is to increase the inventory of employee-owned businesses in the Commonwealth, and we'd love, if there are policy or legal changes that would make sense to help facilitate that. We welcome your thoughts.
Pass Chris's bill. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, at state level, procurement laws, making it easier to give preferences, within a reasonable degree to employee-owned firms would be hugely helpful.
Good time.
Sorry.
No, go right now.
So, following up on giving preferences to employee ownership firms, this can also be at the federal level. The federal government has the ability to give contracts to companies that have certain characteristics. There's precedent on this. And so I think if we push hard enough, we can convince the federal government to do this, perhaps. Another thing is, I think it's really important to have regional information and training offices on employee ownership to sort of help local businesses implement ESOPs or employee ownership. There are a lot of practical elements that are sort of they prevent companies from adopting employee ownership programs. And many of these companies are smaller. They don't have the ability to hire consulting companies, and so I think it's really important to have regional or state level training offices. And also, I think there should be a White House commission on employee ownership. I think that there should be a national effort to inform the nation on the benefits of employee ownership that we just talked about.
Should we move to audience questions? So what we'd like to do, in the interest of time and to make sure that each of our panelists can weigh in, I'm going to maybe field 2 questions at a time, and I invite the panelists to respond to either one of the questions if there's something is more germane to your particular area of expertise. So, Ethan?
So I really appreciated your comments on employee ownership during economic downturns. And that's one of the criticisms of stock options and the PE model, where there's a finite timeline for the payout. And I'm wondering if you share that concern, or if you have thoughts on how to mitigate that concern where employees happen, if a PE firm exits during an economic downturn, employees might not fall.
Okay. And before you answer that, there you go. You raise your hand.
I have a question for Olga. There's a 2015 econometric study of Eroski, which is the largest retailer in the Basque Country and one of the worker cooperatives of the Mondragon system, which finds many of the results that you were mentioning in your presentation, but deviates from something you said. In this study, they find that workers in Eroski show less job satisfaction than similar workers in non-cooperative companies. And the reason why is that these workers claim to be more stressed because of their having to run the companies or the establishments, having the financial risk that they were enduring, and so on. So I was wondering whether you found something similar in your study.
Yeah, absolutely. Or sorry, should I just go ahead? Sorry. Yeah, I think we definitely hear some of those stories as well. I think given that participation just varies so much across the workforce, and there's just a lot of research that's still needed about like why certain people choose to participate more in governance, why others need more support in order to provide meaningful contributions. But definitely that's a story we hear, is that I'm now expected to do my job and also run the business, and that is a lot of extra added stress. But I think for us, I don't know exactly why we didn't see that drop in job satisfaction, but some of the anecdotal evidence that we hear is just that even with that extra added stress, even with the messiness of implementing democracy and all the time and effort that it takes and just the ongoing trainings, people still see so many gains just in their day-to-day jobs and their job quality that it seems well worth it for folks. So I'd definitely be curious for more research to take place just to understand that difference a little bit better.
Democratic decision-making can be painful. I mean, we all see Congress can't agree on anything. I think that, as you mentioned, Eroski is one of the largest worker cooperatives in the world. Mondragon is, but it's very large. And the greater the number of people that are trying to agree on a decision, the more difficult it is to make the decision. So it's positively correlated as you grow in size, and that's definitely a challenge that needs to be sorted out.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because the median number of workers in the U.S. at a worker co-op is 5. So these are very small businesses that we're talking about. So potentially that's the difference, is it's just much easier to implement.
Did you want to address Ethan's question?
Well, okay, so regarding, it takes a long time for the company to be sold, and I think one of the bills that are circulating in Congress are aimed towards addressing this. I'm not the person to speak on that, however, but I think that this is something that is of imminent discussion in the policy circles, but I'm not the expert on it.
Okay.
Related to this, I'm actually the author of the study you mentioned. So yes, we did find that the satisfaction level is lower among those workers working for the Mondragon Eroski stores, but they also have a conventional stores as well. So we did comparison of these things, but I think our main sort of interpretation of the result is that they are asked to do a lot more than just being the employee owner. Right? So the workplace improvement stuff and the information sharing, tons of stuff. So that's not for everyone. So that's our interpretation. That relates to one of the Fidan's sort of comments that so is it really kind of all we need to do is just introduce the broad-based, like equity compensation system? What we really need to do are other things to complement these things. So I think that's a kind of important issue, and there are a lot of studies showing that complementarity between the sort of broad-based equity compensation and then employee involvement and all those things. And I think that's something that we probably need to pay a little more attention to. And so anyway, just since you mentioned our study.
Would any of you care to comment on Takeo's comment? Okay. Derek, you raise your hand.
As Takeo mentioned, I was one of the co-authors as well as Bruce. It's a very interesting study because Eroski has 3 types of units. And the surprising finding was the most cooperative part of the business. And the ones that are on job satisfaction. The ones where job satisfaction is better was the firms where the workers had previously worked for a capitalist firm, they were acquired. So it wasn't really surprising in that sense that they felt
much better about the situation. Anyway.
Lorena, great.
Yeah, I mean, two questions. One is, have any of you done any research about the legalities and the complications of the childcare industry specifically becoming an ESOPs? So that's one question. And the second one is similar to have, one of you mentioned something about creating a state repository or about all the ESOPs in the state, in your states. So same. What are the challenges that you have found and how the process that you have followed to create an accurate repository that represents currently? Because the only thing we have is actually accurate is coming from the Department of Labor. So just those two questions. Thank you.
One way in now, we're doing still another question.
There's been conversations at Richmond about childcare.
Childcare regulations
Yeah.
related to converting into an ESOP specifically, and repositories converting the processes internally within the state to be able to get accurate data.
Yeah. No, I was saying that there's been conversations about creating childcare cooperatives. We have not gotten very far with that. I think it's a great idea because it meets an employment need and it helps others to be able to get to work. So I would like to learn more if someone is kind of further on that.
Yeah, I know not on the ESOP side, but on the co-op side, there's a researcher, her name is Svetlana Masutin, who's focused on studying childcare cooperatives and is doing this big study of cooperative outcomes for childcare businesses. So I feel like she would be an awesome resource and could probably say a lot more, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about ESOPs in childcare, but they're definitely childcare worker cooperatives. And more broadly in the care industry, we see quite a few worker cooperatives, in particular elder care. So there's a very large, elder care cooperative based in New York City, and it seems to be we see this cooperative worker cooperative framework in the care industry in general. But I don't know about ESOPs.
So just to finish the thought, my question was directed because as we know, the regulations for any of those industries, care industries, as other industries, is license directed. So you have to be licensed. And then when you go into a model, then it's a co-op and ESOP or whatever structure is like that, then the license applies for the employee. Therefore, it's not to the business. Therefore, if you are not licensed, you're not licensed, then you cannot continue to work in that industry. That's where I'm going with that. And I'm curious to see what the studies have done and if there has been any legislation or even local. I know in my state there hasn't, but that's where I'm going with that.
What state are you in?
Specifically is you license the person, you don't license the business to be able to operate and work in an employee or in a care study.
So we've got about 6 minutes left. Like to field a question from Julie and Mark, and we'll see where we stand on time after that. So.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But I was really touched by your closing comment around we need more toolkits for mayors.
Yeah.
And it sounded like you were to Evergreen and Cleveland as a model, but I guess I was curious about the right frame for it, right? Employee ownership's a specific tool if we think about economic development, but how we think about shared ownership of real estate is also part of that conversation. So I guess I was curious at what level you all frame the question and what parts of ownership could be shared and managed collectively as a community. And then I'm also curious of other places, maybe this is more for large discussion, other models that folks are looking at. I find the models of Push Buffalo, Co-op Richmond really interesting, where they're looking at building public offer and then networks of cooperatives and then also shared assets, kind of thinking about how these things can work together. And Olga, to your point about co-ops working together. So I guess I'm curious, what framing actually resonates with the city? Is it just employee ownership or is it perhaps expanding?
Mark, do you want to answer your question as well?
Yeah, it's kind of similar in a way, which it has to do with the need for a supportive ecosystem, and what thinking through what are the elements of that supportive ecosystem. I mean, and I'm coming from Brownsville, Texas, which has nothing, and is 300 miles away from the from the nearest large city that can have anything, 400 miles from Austin. So, the thinking about, okay, if we wanted to create for example, something like you have in Richmond, a city department that would, focused on community wealth building, what are the elements that need to be in place within to help to create the kind of supportive ecosystem that can support worker ownership?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and add, Mike, because it sort of relates to this line of questioning, which is also, I feel like one of the things, and I think you brought this up in particular, is there's a mismatch for political purposes in terms of the long-term timing of benefits for employee ownership versus the need for quick wins, kind of short-term. And, and I just think about that, contrasting that with workforce development, which, also meets the near-term emergency needs of people who really need an income now, right? But it's sort of like you have a headache and I get an aspirin, but it doesn't solve the underlying headache, right? Like it doesn't do anything to really change the nature of opportunities that are available to people or address the community wealth building. It just meets an emergency need. So anyway, I guess my question is, how are you thinking about sort of in trying to generate support for policies and things, recognizing sort of this long-term nature of the payoff versus the short-term nature of our political cycles?
Yeah, well, to your last question, my solution has been to find out who's going to run for mayor, who's going to win, and work with them. Done that 3 times now, but it is good to have some stability. Because staff can turn over with the political stuff that they have to rebuild from scratch. I was pleased that when Mayor Johnson won in Chicago, he continued their community wealth building efforts. That's another sort of positive example. But to the question about, it wasn't for lack of residents that the Evergreen thing hasn't taken off in Richmond. It was because A, the legal challenges, and B, it would have been hard for me to recommend let's spend significant amounts of money of public subsidy on something that might generate 100 jobs when we could be helping 1,000 people, particularly through a high quality workforce development program, or investing in after school programs or early childhood education, or the range of things that they're all part of this holistic wealth building picture. And so that's why I think finding a model that in my understanding, Cleveland, and I was sort of an early champion of it, ever helped co-authored an article in The Nation in 2010, but my understanding is that they committed a lot of different funds to it from different federal sources. And there's no way I can go to the mayor of Richmond and say, let's stop you affordable housing to fund something that's going to create 100 jobs. So that's like kind of like the hard reality that I speak to Marine's point that all politicians have to deal with. So coming up with something that's going to be lower cost and lower risk, I think is more the issue than the residents per se. I got a lot of residents. I was surprised. Many Black community folks in Richmond were really, really into the idea. For a time, it was just like became too hard, at least for that particular moment.
Either of you care to weigh in on?
I'll go ahead and jump in on the question about ecosystem gaps. That's something we think about pretty often because in places, even with a supportive city government, a lot of providers in place who can train on democratic management, on business level needs. A lot of the rate limiting that we see is actually the availability of professional services like legal and accounting. And one of the things we talk about frequently is just the massive need to train more of those folks to know exactly what worker ownership is and how it works and how to support businesses with it. So that's something we're trying to focus on, is just kind of bringing more people into the field in that way.
And just to answer Maureen's question, short-term goals versus long-term goals. I think we need a societal shift in how people think about employee ownership. Right now, people don't know very much about it. They don't know all the benefits. And I think that in order to create a long-term perspective in our society, we need a shift, and that takes a lot of training, education, forums like this, and you know, we're many of us are educators. We need to talk to our students about the concept of democratic workplace, and it requires a societal shift, I think.
So Tony, from a time perspective, we were going to take a break until 10:30, but we're going to push that back a little bit since we ran a little bit long.
We'll go 10:35. Okay. So the slide's going to say 10:30. Make it 10:35.
So what I wanted to say is, first of all, I want to thank you. To be in the presence of so many thought leaders in this space is just intimidating, but it's been an honor to be with you today. Please, a round of applause for our panelists.